Chapter 7. Look at this, Sue. I frantically waved my book on wartime code breakers toward her face. Look at this stamp. They've all got it. Every single one of the books I got. Property of peeked out from the edge of a stamp sticker that read, provided to the Winky Public Library by the generous donation of the Starsmith family. How interesting. Susan barely looked up from her current read, which was apparently more engrossing than my outburst. Her eyes were glazed with the look of someone emerging from the land of her dreams and who couldn't bring herself to care about my discovery in the land of reality. It is! I leaped to my feet with the untamed enthusiasm of an overexcited preteen. Books fluttered from my lap and thumped to the floor around me. Imagine, a family owned all of these. Someone else was interested in this. By this time, I was hopping around the room in an oddly choreographed bow-legged happy dance. You are so weird, she huffed, going back to her history of Winky, legend, myth, and fact by local historian and town gossip buff Van Chase. I stuck out my tongue at the back of her head and took myself off to find someone who might share a portion of my newfound enthusiasm. Dad and Uncle Paul were outside overhauling the motor on their fishing boat. Their grunts did sound a little more peppy than Susan's response had been, but I was obviously not getting the big reaction that I wanted from them. I moved on pretty quickly. I found Mom seasoning meat at an ancient picnic table near the back door. Aunt Marisol was a few feet away, gleefully fanning the flames on a huge and possibly even more ancient brick grill. They were arguing about something having to do with supper in that special way that only siblings can use, and I approached slowly. I was not scared. How dare you think that? But I was cautious. Good thing, too. Right after loudly announcing, I know Mother thinks that you're the smart one, Karen, but I am not too stupid to grill a steak. Aunt Marisol let loose with another stream of lighter fluid straight into the center of the grill. Flames leaped several feet into the air. They grew, they multiplied, they flickered through the color spectrum. The heat stretched across the yard in a shimmering haze. I watched, rooted to my spot in equal parts horror and fascination, as my mother grabbed her sister and yanked her through the overgrown weeds. They reached the edge of the woods just in time. The flame's expansion became too much for the old grill. With a tremendous, earth shaking roar, it exploded. I saw Mom and Marisol drop and was finally shaken out of my impression of a statue. I started to run toward them, narrowly avoiding the bit of still flaming wood that dropped to where I had been mere seconds before. A flying corner of brick fell so close to my nose that I went cross-eyed for a second and stumbled to a stop. That second was all it took for Dad to race past me. Frantic shouts filled the air. Uncle Paul and two men I had never seen before were busily slapping out the last of the flames, and there was an almost perfect circle of debris surrounding the wrecked cooker. Bowen! Mom was up and jogging toward me with a slight gimp. She had a small cut trickling blood sluggishly down one arm, and she was favoring her right ankle, but she seemed otherwise unharmed and very concerned for me. When I took a step toward her, the reason for her concern became glaringly obvious to me. A piece of brick was stuck to my shoe with a bit of broken metal. She was, understandably, freaking out. I, however, wasn't in any pain, and my attention was drawn elsewhere. Aunt Marisol was a hot mess. Black streaks of singed hair were flaking off all along her arms. Her right eyebrow had been burned completely away, and a nasty cut was freely bleeding on her left cheek. She had broken free from my dad's helping hands and was hobbling toward her husband and the scene of the explosion on unsteady feet. Eyes wide with shock and probably a bit of concussion, she kept muttering to herself as she staggered dazedly up to the ruins of our supper plans. I don't understand. I cleaned it twice. She turned to Uncle Paul and gripped the front of his shirt, her eyes begging him to believe her. I don't understand. I cleaned it twice. We were sure it was ready to use. I just don't understand what happened. Uncle Paul gently wrapped an arm around her shoulders and picked his way across the debris-strewn yard, leading her to the miraculously unharmed picnic table. A siren grew ever closer, and suddenly an ambulance and a fire truck appeared in our yard. It felt like forever happened in between the explosion and the arrival of the emergency workers, but in reality they managed to reach us in an astoundingly fast 7 minutes. In fact, they made it to us and Marisol and myself in the midst of being checked out, before Sue and Jack made it out of the house to see what the hubbub was all about. The EMTs pronounced Mom and I to be in need of soaks in a bathtub and some antiseptic for our random cuts. The melted metal stuck to my shoe had miraculously not made it past my shoe's laces and tongue, so while the pair of tennis shoes was down for the count, My foot was only slightly bruised from impact. Mom's ankle was twisted and her arm needed a band aid. The MTs only had cartoon character band aids. My mother was thrilled. We all needed tetanus shots. Aunt Marisol, however, required a little more treatment than the ambulance could provide. So as soon as Mom and I were placed on 24-hour house arrest, the firemen declared our mess safe to leave. Aunt Marisol was carted off to the hospital for further treatment, with Uncle Paul following close behind. Marisol was allowed to come home a few hours later, having received burn treatment, 11 stitches on her arm, a butterfly closure to her cheek, and some pain pills that made her super fun to talk to for the next week or so. In all of the chaos, I had completely forgotten the reason why I had been out there in the first place, until Susan introduced me to the two men who had raced across the rocky shoreline in order to help my uncle put out the fire. One, Mr. Andrew Zane, was a longtime summer resident at Lake Weekasink and owned a little bait and gas station we'd noticed beside the highway turnoff. The other man, Mr. Zane's childhood best friend from the town of Weeki, was a Mr. Van Chase. Before I could even register that the name sounded familiar, Susan was waving her local history books in my face, while their author smiled somewhat shyly at her enthusiasm. Tell him who used to live here, Mr. Chase, Susan urged. He'll love it. You'll love this bone. Go on, Mr. Chase, tell him. When the man didn't immediately rush to do her bidding during the split second in which she paused to take a breath, Susan rushed on ahead and blurted out, The Starsmith family, Bowen. That's who used to live here. I stared at her blankly for a moment before realization began to dawn on me. The Starsmith family. The family whose large collection of books on a certain subject I had just checked out from the public library. That family had once lived in our house. It was astounding. It was amazing. It made perfect sense. It was then that I realized my hands no longer clung to the book that I had been carrying through the yard when the world burst open. Before I could say anything about it, though, Jack raced around the corner, barreling right over Susan with a bone-jarring thud. It seemed we would all be sporting bruises before supper time. My smirk died on my lips when I looked at my brother's face. His eyes were wide, he was sweating buckets, and he couldn't seem to catch a good breath. Hey, he pounded out painfully. You guys had better come see this. With his message delivered, Jack bolted back around the corner, clearly expecting us to follow him. We did.